I'm trying not to be cliched, but the truth is, trust is the delta between what you say you'll do and what you actually do. And you can control that from the first moment that you walk through the door.
Hi, I'm Josh McKenzie, and this is Graduate Edge, stories and advice for graduates everywhere. In this first episode, I'm talking with Josh Tyler. Josh is head of contact and transformation strategy at Virgin Media O2, one of the largest and most well-known telecommunications companies in the United Kingdom. Here's the thing, Josh's career has not been a straight line. He's faced redundancy. He's had to set boundaries with his manager when the long hours became unsustainable. Right now, he's watching AI transform his entire industry in real time. And he started out at Virgin Media on a graduate program. But what really struck me in our conversation was that Josh believes more people feel like imposters than we realize, that fewer people are actually scrutinizing us early in our career than maybe we think they are, and that we need to trust ourselves most, that we're going to figure it all out. We talk about why trust isn't just about good intentions, it's about follow through, why networking saved him when his role was eliminated, what networking is and is not, and why AI represents a revolution, not an evolution, if I recall it correctly, and what that means if you're just starting out in your professional career now. If you've ever felt out of place at work or have had moments where you've felt out of place at work, if you're excited about the future, or maybe if you're a bit worried about the future in this changing world, or wondered if you'd actually ever figured this whole career thing out, this conversation's for you. Welcome to the first episode of Graduate Edge. How did it feel for you when you came out of university and you were entering the workforce? You'd studied at Bristol and Oxford. You come out into the workforce in the UK. You find yourself in a company like Virgin Media. What were some of the feelings you had? What was going through your head?
Yeah, it was quite, I must admit, it was quite disorienting. And I remember it quite viscerally actually, because it was such a departure from what I was used to in university. I think you go through education and everything is, particularly in the UK, everything is incredibly structured. So, you know exactly where you should be, when you should be there, for how long. And at university, the reins are slackened a little bit and you get a little bit of a chance to sort of um, explore what it might be like to sort of organize yourself for a while. But it's nothing in comparison to the world of work. And I think that is in the context of landing in a graduate scheme as well, which I think comparative to just a landing role, which a lot of young people, don't go through the graduate track necessarily, is relatively is quite well structured. So it's definitely a sense of disorientation, but it was also a sense of excitement. I seem to remember early days when I was on the graduate scheme, and our graduate scheme was structured as a rotation, which a lot of grad programs are. And we rotated essentially through our customer's journey, which was really cool. So we got to get this kind of like bird's eye view of how the business operates. And we started off in a sales environment. So we started off in kind of, well, how does our go-to-market strategy work? How do we capture the customer's interest? What are our sales processes like? And we actually did that in a retail environment, which was quite interesting. So we were kind of face to face with customers. And then we went through to our installation. So obviously being in a telecommunications company, big part of the customer journey is the installation of their services. So we followed field teams and we were responsible for leadership of field teams, installing and servicing customers' equipment. And then we went into a contact center environment, which was kind of in the logical flow of the customer journey. It's kind of like we've sold to the customer, we've installed their services, and then something's gone wrong. So they've contacted us to talk about a problem, something wrong with their bill, whatever. And I think that was a brilliant start to my career, because what it got up in front of me straight away was the dissonances that exist between huge operational areas within the business, and the kind of the damage that we were doing to each other quite often sort of unknowingly. And it allowed you to kind of, from the get-go, instead of just focusing on the detail of a of an entry level role, it allowed you to do that thing, which actually you tend to only do once you're much further on in your career, which is zoom out and look at the strategic implications of how your organization is hung
Mm,
together.
mm.
And a huge advantage. And it was a huge privilege to get that kind of
Yeah,
experience at such an
I
early
can imagine
stage.
that level of exposure be along the value, essentially along the value chain, and rotating through those areas would have been incredibly um, helpful and insightful, and would have added some structure that you would have maybe been that we are familiar with from study and the educational structure. You mentioned feeling disorientated, though. What was disorientating?
Yeah, I think for me, there was a couple of things. The first was that because it was on a 6 month rotation, new sets of people, new people to try and impress and, kind of build relationships with. Often it was different physical locations as well. So I was moving around the country a little bit. I had a stint in London. I had a stint in Manchester. So there was an element of, there was a lack of fixity, which I think played a part in that sort of sense of disorientation. But also, what I realized looking back on it is that that was actually a great way to start my career, because all of the change that inevitably happens in anyone's role has felt very comfortable since that point. Because change was almost the breakfast that you ate when you first got into the business.
And I can see, and we see this with lots of people and coming out of the education system and moving into professional work on some sort of early talent program is, the educational experience is so structured, right? You know exactly what you're going to be doing at 10 a.m. on Wednesday for the next 3 or 4 months, kind of one term or semester at a time, or whatever it might be. You know where you're going to be, what you're going to be learning about, who you're going to be in a room with, etc. And when you come into the working world, so cliche, but it's so true that like no 2 days are the same. No idea what you're going to be doing at 10 a.m. on Wednesday next month. And so it's a rapid fire introduction to working amongst constant change. Tell me about some moments, maybe some edgy kind of moments, where you found yourself having to sort of consider an opportunity or facing a barrier or a challenge that you kind of had to face into reasonably early in your career.
Yeah, I've got a really, as soon as you said that, a really vivid memory popped into my mind actually, because to give the context, right, 22, 23 years old, coming into a contact center in Manchester, and one of the way that the scheme was structured was they wanted to give you operational management experience from the get go. So they chucked you into the deep end and they said, go and manage this team. And this specific team that I was given was a little bit kind of underperforming. They were seen as unfairly, in my opinion, but they were seen as this kind of problem child team. And I think the management team were just kind of like, let's try a new approach. Like, let's see what happens if we just chuck this grad at them and like kind of let's see what falls out of it. And I remember coming in to the first day that I was supposed to be leading the team. I think there was a team of about 12 contact center agents. And I walked up to the desk and the first lady that I spoke to looked at me, looked me up and down and went, "How old are you?" And that sort of set the tone for at least the first sort of like 2 months. So it was a really sort of intimidating environment where a lot of the people in that team had aspirations to become managers of that team as well. So I was very conscious and very aware that my presence there wasn't particularly welcome, right? But it gave me an incredible set of lessons in terms of, well, how do you get people on your side? I had not a very long time to build good quality relationships with these people, work out how we were going to, change the trajectory of the team from a performance point of view. How are we going to rebuild the culture? How are we going to get to a place where, everyone was happy and thriving and, in a sense of flow? That initial sort of reaction was quite jarring. And that was almost a wake up call that like, this is real life. Like
Yeah.
this is work.
Yeah, I bet. So how did you go about building relationships? Well, were you able to build relationships? And if so, how did you go about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we got there. We got there eventually, but it was not. It was a bumpy ride, and there were moments where there was There were, some of the people in the team very experienced, had been there for a long time, knew a huge amount, who just fundamentally were not bought into the idea of a graduate's fresh from university, being put into a position of authority. And so the way that I tried to deal with that was to almost eschew the hierarchy to an extent, is to put that to one side and just get to know each of the people in my team. So I spent a lot of time sitting with them and not just understanding how they are at work, but I remember this one lady who she had a particular problem with me, I think, to begin with. But I sat and I listened and I tried to work out who she was as a person, like what was her family situation, how long had she been in the business, what made her tick, what did she like and not like, and eventually I think people saw that there was genuine interest there from me. And this wasn't just about climbing the ladder. This was about me trying to create a positive
Mm.
impact. And the lesson that it taught was around intent. So I think if you can be clear on your intent, like why are you there and what are you trying to achieve? And are those relationships just utilitarian or are they serving a deeper purpose? I think you can overcome almost any rocky start. And I think that's something that, filled me with a lot of confidence about how important good quality relationships kind
And
of
that
actually are.
that idea of
Um,
intent that you speak of really goes to the heart of relationship building, like not in rocky moments. Like even if you weren't 23 and thrust into, leading a team in a contact center or anywhere else, it really goes to the heart of building trust, doesn't it?
yeah, 100%. And we've done a lot of work in our business on the trust equation and what are the components of trust. And when I reflect on the moments in my career that have gone well, it's the moments where unknowingly, usually and unconsciously, those elements of the trust equation have been met. And it's things like, competence and integrity, and integrity comes back to, what is this person's perception of your intent? Because your integrity isn't just what you put out into the world, it's how it's perceived. And I think there's a lot of time and effort that needs to go into working out how you're going to build trust with the people around you.
So thinking now back, putting yourself in a graduate's shoes now, or someone starting out early in a professional career, how should a young professional
Mm.
build trust while they're still learning, still finding their feet? They're in that first year or two. What are some things that they can do you think, to build trust?
It's a great question. I think the first thing to do is not fall into the trap that I fell into, quite honestly. And the trap that I fell into was that the only way that I'm going to build trust is through knowledge. I almost equated knowledge with value. Um, and I think when you are in a graduate role, knowledge is not your superpower. You're not going to have more knowledge than someone who's been doing the role for 10 years, as hard as you try. And, I put a huge amount of effort trying to build my knowledge, and there was nothing wrong with that. And I got myself to a reasonable level of understanding, which was great. But it was never the value that I was adding to the role. The value that I was adding was offering a different perspective, was coming at a problem from my training in university as to how to kind of think critically and break down an issue and come up with a set of solutions and play those back to the people who were making decisions. And I think if I could speak to my original self, I would say, don't try and drive trust through knowing everything, because it's really transparent. Like you're never going to be able to know everything. And actually, most of the people around you don't expect you to know everything. Like that's not why you're there. And I think I wish I'd been able to sort of see that a little bit earlier in my own journey. And I see it with people in my team now. I've very recently hired a team which is, comprised of 3 or 4 ex grad scheme sort of people. And I've had that conversation with my team on multiple occasions, like, work out where your value is. You don't need to know everything. And I think that's really important. The topic of trust, though, there are some really practical things I think that you can do. Trying not to be cliched, but the truth is that trust what trust boils down to, or in my experience, what it has boiled down to, is the delta between what you say you'll do and what you actually do. And that is a delta that you can control from the first moment that you walk through the door. Like, and there's a load of stuff around overcommitting and under promising and overcommitting and over delivering and under delivering. And it's not about that. It's about on a person to person basis. If you say you're going to do something, do it, and do it to the standard that you say you were going to do it, and do it to the time frames that you've set yourself. And if you can't, communicate. And I think it's a very, very basic and very seemingly very simple concept, but doing that consistently is probably the one thing in the early years of my career that allowed me to build good relationships with people in
Mm.
positions of seniority and decision makers.
It sounds like your entrance into the professional working world was, I mean, shaped by many things, no doubt. And one of the big lessons, themes in your story is about relationships. If we move on a little bit, I'm looking for another sort of significant moment, maybe a little bit further on. Maybe you're off, you're no longer a grad. Maybe a few more years in. Tell me about another moment that felt a bit edgy. Maybe an opportunity, a challenge, a moment where you had to make a decision. What was another moment?
Absolutely. The one that comes to mind, Josh, I was probably 3 or 4 years post grad scheme. So still relatively early career. I become established in the role that I was in. We were going through it. We were going through an organizational restructure, and my role was made redundant. At the time, I really struggled, by the way, to differentiate between my role being made redundant and me being made redundant. So first lesson that I had to learn was, this isn't personal. Like most people you see who are 10 to 15 years into a career have experienced this at some point. And, it is part of the machinations of how a business works. But it felt personal at the time, because I'd committed a huge amount of effort and time and energy and thought to this role. And then all of a sudden I was kind of in this situation where I was being made redundant. It didn't help that I had a 3-month-old baby at the time, and we were also trying to move house.
Wow.
So it was, very, very quickly, sort of life had slapped me around the face,
Yes.
and I'd woken up, and I'm still in my 20s. Yeah, I'm sort of mid-20s, mid to late 20s at this point. And I think the full weight of responsibility that I'd taken on as a father and as a husband, because I was recently married as well, as a homeowner, just as an adult, like, hit me in that moment. What happened at that point was that, or the way that I dealt with it was that I spoke to my network. So my natural reaction, and this wasn't a conscious decision, it was my means of trying to problem solve the situation, I think, is that I went and spoke to people that I trusted, had a lot of conversation, just said, look, you guys, you've been in this situation before. What do you do? Like, this is the first time I've experienced it. Like, help, and I think what I found from that process, well, two things that came out of that process. The first was that one of the options that I ended up having, so you talked about a choice just before and a decision that I needed to make. Well, the fact that I had a decision at all was as a result of some of the conversations that I'd had with some of the people in my network. One of the people that I spoke to, and was just kind of, at the time, the intention of the conversation was literally just to kind of, spitball some ideas and kind of go, what can I do? Like, what's your experience of this situation? And before we even got into the conversation, he said, I know what you're going to say. Hold that thought. I've actually got a role that we've just advertised for. I think you'd be great at it. Here's the catch. The catch is that you are currently, and we've got like a level system in where you're an L5. This is an L4 role. So it's a step down in inverted commas. I said, okay, just tell me more about the role. I was interested, and tell me more about what the role entailed and what there was to do. So my awareness of that role came out of that willingness to kind of come back to my network and sort of seek advice.
Sounds like you had to build relationships, and your networking gets talked a lot about early in careers, and one of the skills you need to build. But it sounds like when you were then faced with this scenario of being made redundant for 3, 4, 5 years into your career, it was your
Yeah.
relationships that you turned to, and it was actually sitting down with someone over a coffee or a drink or at lunch or whatever, whatever it might have been, trying to problem solve using relationships, using networks around you, that actually your next opportunity came up. So, which leads me to the question of what where would you have found yourself if you did not have those relationships? Like if you hadn't have put the effort in to building trust, building relationships, connecting with people, 4 or 5 years in, you find yourself redundant. Tell me a little bit about that scenario. Like what do you think would have happened then?
Well, the truth is, it would have massively reduced my ability to choose and to get myself out of that situation. So it would have essentially had very, very limited options had I not invested time and energy in building in a relationship. And I just want to talk very briefly, if you don't mind, Josh, about networking, because I think it has this horrible kind of image of, like, lots of nervous, buttoned up grads going to a drinks reception, work in the crowd. Like, that isn't my experience of networking at all. And, I'm not sure if I'm alone in this, but I certainly hope I'm not. But I find that just the idea of that to be quite cringeworthy. I'm naturally quite an introverted person. So that the concept of proactive networking in a kind of traditional sense, or a sense that you might read in a business book, is not the way that networking has worked for me
How has
personally.
it worked for you? I think many would share your. I think many, not most, would share your view. What is your point of view on networking? Then, what is it?
It goes back to trust. It's built on the relationships of trust that you build through the work that you do. So I think where I've had really strong networks, it's been as a result of two things. One, because I've, professionally sort of proved myself in a certain context, but often it's just where I've kind of brought myself to work a little bit and had a laugh with someone and tried to connect with someone on a personal level, outside of the person that they are when they're in work. And I think there is this sort of, certainly I fell into the trap in the first couple of years of my career. There's almost this sense that you kind of leave you kind of your personality at the door a little bit, and you become this work version of yourself in this kind of strange sort of puppet show that is work. Um, and it isn't, what I realized really quickly was that I couldn't do that for 40 years. I had to be myself. I had to work out a way of being true to my own sense of my personality, but also my values. And I had to bring that to work. And I think that, to go back to the whole kind of concept of, well, how does that help with trust? Well, the way that it helps is that people see beyond the work mask, and they get a sense of who you are as a person, and they connect with you on a
Uh,
level that's completely impossible if all of your relationships are built on the premise of the
uh
transaction of work. And I think that for me was a really critical learning in terms of how networking is actually done.
It almost sounds like, if you're going to rewrite a definition of networking, it's not how many people have you met and how many people know you. It's who trusts you and to what degree. That's your net.
Yes, completely agree. And someone said something to me once about the role of a strong network, and mentoring was an element of this, right? And hopefully we'll come on to mentoring in the conversation. But, what is the power of a network, and like, why do you do this? Like, why do you spend time building relationships? And I think I read a quote once, and it was something along the lines of, the trajectory of someone's career is often based on the conversations that other people are willing to have about you in rooms that you're not in. And that really landed with me, because I was like, this is how decisions are made, right? Like, you need someone who is an advocate for you as a
Yeah.
person, not just someone who goes, yeah, Josh, yeah, he's great at spreadsheets, like, irrelevant. Who are you as a person? That matters.
Yeah, that's such a great principle to understand early, and carry through, and it gets into sort of reputation and brand, and this essence that actually it's what people say about you when you're not in the room. That's your reputation, and who's saying it, and what are they saying? That's your network. And yeah, for you in this moment, that was incredibly powerful, because you found yourself redundant unexpectedly, a lot going on at life. And yeah, I got to say, mid-20s, married, small child, kicking goals at work, made redundant, you had a bit going on, moving house, etc. It was the people who trusted you who were able to help you most. It does lead me to wonder, though, Josh, for you said you were introverted, and I relate to that. I'm introverted as well. I've worked very, very hard at communication and building relationships, and all through my career, I relate to being introverted and building relationships. Being someone who's therefore kind of relationship oriented, or someone who values relationships. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your boundaries were challenged, or you were working too hard for whatever reason, for people you respected, and maybe wanted to work hard for, right? Maybe it wasn't maybe it wasn't against your will. And tell us about a moment where maybe that unfolded.
Yeah, it's a great topic, and it's a great topic for early on in career, because I think this leads to the whole setting of boundaries. I think is an incredibly difficult thing to approach early on in your career for most people, not for everyone, but for people like you and I, Josh, are a little bit more introverted, a little bit more kind of just want to get on with the job. It can be a very, very difficult conversation to have. And I think there was a moment in my career, and it wasn't too far away in terms of timeline from the redundancy. I think it was the following role that I took after that situation occurred. And what I realized, and maybe it was in response to the whole fact that, I'd been made redundant previously, and that was probably playing on my mind a little bit. And I was pushing the boundaries. I was doing a lot of hours. I was working really hard. I wasn't seeing my family as much as I should have. I was checking out at weekends sometimes, like my mind was elsewhere. And it was really obvious to my family that was happening. And the thing that changed it all for me was I read a post. This particular thing landed with me in a really kind of profound way. And the quote was, in 20 years' time, the only people who are going to remember the extra hours that you've worked are your kids. Being a new, being a new dad, that just,
Wow.
it knocked me for six. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
I couldn't get this thought out of my head. And where it led to, Josh, was I sat down with my manager. I was new to this particular manager, right? Like they didn't know me that well. I didn't know them that well. We were still in that kind of forming relationship phase. And I sat down and I just brought him in on my thinking. And I was like, look, here's where my head's at. Like, I want to progress. I want to do really well. But I'm not willing to do that at the expense of the relationships that I'm actually doing all of this for anyway, which is my family, right? I'm here to build an amazing life for my family. In order for us to have an amazing life, I actually have to be there. Like I have to be part of that. And it was such a good conversation. And actually it was inspired by a chat that I'd had with my own dad. I remember my dad, he was a service engineer, which meant that he was out all the time as a kid. Like I remember he was away, he was in different countries, he was always on the road. Growing up, my memories are of me, my brother and my mum. And my dad had said to me, I think we were out for his birthday or something. And he'd said to me, it's the one thing that he regrets in his life, the amount of time that he spent away and the amount of time that he dedicated to work. And he was like, if you can realize that quickly, sort of at this point in your life, and this point in your career, then, maybe you can kind of prevent yourself from falling into the same traps. That was probably the first experience I'd have of having what I felt was a really necessary boundary setting conversation in order to change the inflection of the way that I was working, because I'd worked out that it's sustainable, and that balance just wasn't there.
How did you feel in the lead up to that conversation? And were you at all worried or scared of the consequences of laying it down on the line? It was going to go one of two ways, right? This manager was either going to say, you know what, totally understand. Let's talk about how we change the hours. Or it could have gone the other way, which was, understand what you're saying, but I need someone who's going to knock out 60, 70 hours a week, and it needs to be the number one priority. If it's not you, I'll look for someone else. So like, how did it feel going into that conversation? Were you concerned about the consequences potentially?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I would have been crazy not to have been at least a bit worried about that. Um, there were a couple of things that were on my side, I think. The first was I had a sense of the culture, right? At this point, 4 or 5 years into working for the business, it was a fairly kind of psychologically safe place to be. I knew that if I said something that cut against the grain, which is kind of what I was doing here, it wasn't going to be met with derision. It might not have gone my way, but it wasn't going to be met with derision. So it was maybe a 70-30 shot rather than a 50-50 shot. There's still some risk, without a doubt. It was probably the first moment in my career where I'd really taken a risk. But what I realized, and I'm not sure if I realized this at the time or if I realized it on reflection, but what I realized was this isn't a risk for me at all, because the reason that I'm making this decision is because it aligns completely with my values. It aligns completely with how I want to do work. And if this is just a moment that I have to find out whether I can work to my values in this company, then so be it. And that almost led me to the point where when I was having the conversation, I didn't really feel nervous because I was kind of like, well, this is just a sliding doors moment. That's all it is. I've just kind of engineered a sliding doors moment where it'll either go one way or the other. And both of those decisions will be fine because the outcome will be that I will end up on a track that aligns to my
And
value.
that's the
And I think,
lesson, really, isn't it? That actually, if something difficult needs doing, or a difficult conversation with a colleague or a manager, or trying to decide whether to take an opportunity or turn something down, or setting boundaries if the hours are getting too much, it's affecting your health and well-being. If it's coming from your highest order values, it kind of doesn't matter. So I mean, that's what I'm hearing from your stories, that actually you had nothing to lose, because if it had been, no, you need to keep pulling 60, 70 hours, you probably would have tapped out anyway. Not maybe not the next day, but you would have gone, okay, well, I need to find another path, because of the
yeah,
motivation that's stemming, that was being given to you from those really strong values, was way more important to you than keeping that manager happy or continuing in that particular job.
that's exactly it. And I think you've touched on the exact point, which is all it was doing was putting me on a path. Like that's all that conversation was doing. When you boiled it down to brass tacks, it was putting me on a path that was aligned to my
Mm.
values. Now that could have meant a little bit of short-term pain. I'm really thankful that it didn't mean that, and it confirmed what I thought I knew about the business, which was it's quite supportive of conversations like that. But sometimes you get those judgments wrong, right? You misjudge the culture of an organization, and that's fine as
Yeah,
well.
you can misjudge the culture of an organization, or the culture of the organization can be seemingly great, but you might find yourself with a manager who's not, right, who's not representative. Or you might find yourself in a subculture within the business. But the overall culture seems wonderful, but actually the culture in this area or department is pretty ordinary, not that psychologically safe, and maybe a conversation like the one you had much higher risk, and then it becomes a values decision, and you might need to wear a bit of short-term gain, but actually the fulfillment of your values is what matters, not keeping that manager happy or staying in that job for 12 months longer than you need to, or whatever it might be. I'm going to shift gears now. A lot of people are talking about AI, and I want to hear from you. You're in a really interesting role now. You've done some great things at Virgin Media and transformation, particularly for the customer area of a very well-known telecommunications business in the UK. Should graduates and young professionals today be worried about AI in the workplace?
No, but they should be aware of it, and they should understand it. I think would be my guidance. There are huge opportunities that exist as a result of AI in the way that we work, in specifically in the capability and support that it will offer to our customers. I think we're on the precipice of a new age of customer experience and customer service, which for someone in my kind of role, where I'm responsible for how do we drive our organization to a competitive position that is based on how strong the relationship is with the customer, it's hugely exciting. But I have reflected and put myself in the shoes of going back to being that 22-year-old and coming out of university and seeing everything that's changing in the world of work. And I can imagine that is probably quite fraught with uncertainty for a lot of people. What I would say is that, um, the future of work, and this is something that's become abundantly clear to me, is one of hybridity between human and machine. It is not one of replacement. It is not one of isolation. And I think that that's why there is such a huge opportunity for people who are coming into businesses now, because if you can leverage the skills that you've learned in a higher education environment, particularly, which allow you to learn, understand, and adapt quickly to new ideas, you can become the thought leader within your organization for how AI can deliver value. And I think for me, that is based on not being afraid of it, not being resistant to it, accepting that, agentic AI, which is the variant of AI, which is playing so heavily in a customer service environment, is here to stay. But there's a huge amount to learn about it, and there's a huge amount of value that can and will be derived.
And is hybridity, in your view? People are saying this is sort of sound cliche, but this is revolution, evolution. This is a big shift in how we live, how we work, how stuff gets done.
Yes,
Is that where you're coming from? It's human and machine in the workplace.
absolutely. I read, and I would definitely recommend to the listeners, to get yourself signed up to a really high quality publication. I mean, McKinsey do some really interesting articles from their quantum black practice. Really interesting articles on kind of the future of AI and how it's going to shape the workplace. So great basis for understanding how it's going to play through. In some of the reading that I've done and the research that we've done as a team, it's become very apparent that most commentators on AI believe that this is the biggest thing that has changed the way we work since the introduction of the internet. Like, that's how big this is. This is fundamental structural change. And I think that in and of itself, hugely exciting.
So my final question before we move on just on the AI context is graduates and coming out of school or college or university into the working world now, maybe feeling a bit anxious, a bit uncertain, as you say. They are coming into a working world that is talking about AI replacing jobs, AI changing everything. Some would argue some education systems, institutions, etc., are a little out of touch already. And for a young person coming into this reality now, starting out in their career, what would your advice be in terms of how they approach it?
Do you know what? Other than the element of openness to learning about it, I think my advice wouldn't change that much. My advice to someone starting out would be coachable. Like, be someone who is really easy to work with, because that's actually a kind of a skill set early on in your career. And it is a skill set. Being easy to work with is something that you have to work on, because you have to work out how you adapt yourself to different people, right? But I think the core tenets of how to conduct yourself don't change. The human element of the human machine hybridity actually becomes more important, because the relationships you build and the quality of those relationships has more of an impact in a world where half of the work that's being done is being done by a machine than it does, in a world where it's all being done by humans, right? So I think that if anything, it probably underscores and emphasizes the importance of those human relationships in that context. I think the other thing that I would say, Josh, is lean into, and really think about what is actually going to change on the ground. Like, what does human machine hybridity look like in the context that you are working in? So I'll give you a great example. In a contact center environment, a contact center agent won't just handle calls anymore. They will supervise agentic agents who are having conversations with customers, and they will make decisions about what the agentic should and shouldn't be doing, the guardrails which they should be operating in, right? So if you're in that sort of headspace of, I'm starting off in a service environment, okay, well, think through the 2 or 3 key roles that exist in that area, and think about how they're likely to be shaped by the technologies that you're learning about. Because if you can get ahead of that, you can start to lead the charge on how your organization evolves around.
Yeah, and
forms of
Be
AI.
be be the one in the room that puts your hand up and says, "Yeah, I'll work on that project because I've got some ideas, or maybe I don't have any ideas, but I want to learn, want to
Yes.
understand." So say yes to the opportunities of anything to do with change, transformation, rethinking, reimagining how something gets done, anything to do with AI enablement in the workplace right now. I feel like as a graduate, it's a door to run through. Right? Put your hand up and say,
Oh,
I'll be on that
100%.
team. Maybe you're just talking about boundaries. Maybe I'll even do a few extra hours or whatever, just to be part of that conversation. It's such a big opportunity. More broadly speaking, if you could give your 22-year-old self now 2 or 3 pieces of advice, what do you think they'd be?
Really, really, really good question. The first one that I would give myself is some, sometimes I think about like going back to when I was 22 and just giving myself a proper shake.
Ah,
Do you know what I mean?
yes.
And going, like, just stop being so self-absorbed. One of the key things that I realized when I look back is I was so concerned what other people thought about me to the extent that I completely missed the fact that they were probably in the phase of, life that I'm at now, which is I barely have time to think about what I'm going to wear. Never mind what the new graduate is doing. People are thinking about you far less critically and far less often than you think they are. I think, that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is that that feeling of imposter syndrome, which we touched on earlier in the conversation, really common and way more common amongst mid and even experienced professionals than you would believe. And I think that would have been so liberating to understand that at that point, because I just thought that that was part and parcel of the new, the early careers experience was, you know, yeah, I don't know enough. And as a result, I don't have any value. And it goes back to that point of just don't equate what you know with your potential value that you can add, because they're not the same thing. And they're definitely not the same thing in the first, 5 to 10 years of your career. Maybe when you're 25 years in and, you are an industry wide expert in something, sure, that's when you retire and you become a consultant and people spend, $1,000 an hour on your time. But like right now, doesn't matter.
So let's pause on that just for a moment, if we can, before we go on to your next piece of advice. Are there moments where you still feel like an imposter?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I feel like I'm going to be aping the words of like Stephen Bartlett or someone far smarter than me who's probably said this in a much more eloquent way before, but it's a hallmark of growth. Like you sat there in a room of people where you think, I don't know whether, I don't know whether I should be here. What you've got to remember is you're not in that room without lots of other people being okay with you being in that room. And that means that you've earned being in that room. And what it also means is that if you're looking around and you're not the smartest person, great, because your capacity to learn,
Yeah.
absorb, grow is at its
Yeah.
highest point.
There's real power actually in always making sure you're not the smartest person in the room. And not to say there
Absolutely.
might not be moments further on in your career, fine, but in the kind of regular makeup, the regular fabric of how you work, what you're doing, who you're spending time with, what value you're bringing to the world through your job or whatever it might be. In the main, generally try and make sure you're not the smartest person in the room most of the time. At least of the point you make around, people are far more concerned about the stuff, what shirt are you going to wear, or what's going on in your own life with your own family, your own job. The cognitive load is high enough. They're not thinking about you, not to the
Absolutely.
extent or as often as we might think that they are. Another piece of advice before we move on.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing that that has sometimes held me back personally is my unwillingness to make a decision. And this is probably a personality trait as much as it is a coachable element of someone's behavior. But I do think it is relevant for an early careers person because I think you're a lot more reticent to make decisions in the first few years of your career for fear of failure, for fear of it not going right and what the implications of that could be. Jeff Bezos, he's clearly a very successful man and has got some really good ideas. One thing that he has said that has really, really stuck with me when it comes to decision making is there are type 1 and there are type 2 decisions. And the type 1 decision is the decision that you can walk through that door more than once. If you make a decision, it's not irreversible. You can make the decision, you can walk through the door doesn't lock behind you. Work out what that decision implies, what impact it has. If you don't like it, it's not going the way you thought it would, walk back through the door. And what you find is, and this is the bit that is, you can only really learn through experience, is that 95% of decisions fall into that type 1 category, that you can walk back through the door. There are very few decisions, particularly in your early career, that you will need to make that are type 2 decisions, that you can't walk through the door. Once it's done, it's done. And I think freeing yourself up to increase the velocity of your decision making, stop spending so much time sat on the fence, and if done is better than like perfect, that kind of mentality is really, really helpful in the first few years.
Right. Increase the velocity of decisions, realize that 95% of the decisions you make in your job or about your career or what you want to do are type 1. If it doesn't work out, you can make it again. You can walk back out the door, walk back in another one. Very, very few are type 2 decisions that are kind of really, really fixed. And yeah, that's a wonderfully empowering premise. I'm actually wondering that's really great for early career. I'm wondering for a little bit further on in career, most decisions are type 1.
I think it has a huge amount of validity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Particularly when you're led to believe as you progress through your career that what's riding on your decision becomes all the
Yeah.
more
Yes.
important. But the reality is lots of them you can undo.
Looking back at your younger self now, if we think about Josh coming out of university, starting out as a grad, what would surprise him most about where you've ended up?
I think what would surprise him most is all the things that I used to worry about in early career. I worked them out. I tricked myself into believing that there were a whole bunch of things going on in my career that I didn't have the answers to, and maybe would never have the answers to, and wouldn't be able to unlock. And whether it was what's the route to get into a role that I really enjoy, or how do I get promoted, or all of these things that just weigh on you. And I think particularly when you've been to university and your experience of the education system is that I'm good at this, and that's why you continue in education. You come into the working world, you've got no idea whether you're going to be good at it. I think the one thing that would impress 22-year-old me about 35-year-old me is that I worked out how to do those things. So actually, I should just trust myself a bit more. And if I'd done that at the age of 22, then maybe I would have come to these realizations when I was 30 and not 35 or whatever, you know? So I think it's have a little bit more belief that you'll work it out.
There's a really nice point there, I think, that we might leave this conversation on. We started talking about trust and building trust with other people. And actually now looking back, what you're saying is trust yourself, you work it out. Most decisions don't matter as much as you think they do. No one's paying as much attention to you as you think they are. Everyone's dealing with imposter syndrome most of the time, or at least some of the time. Relationships matter. Work on the relationship with yourself and kind of take it from there. Really great conversation, Josh. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate your time.
I thank you so much for having me, Josh. Appreciate it.